Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies Intro to Archives lecture, Community Archives. Okay, and so here are our weekly topics. What are community archives? Why do community archives exist? What are some essential aspects of community archives? And how do some community archives challenge traditional archival practices? And we'll talk about why I have some here later on in this lecture. Okay, so we'll be looking at 4 of our course learning objectives for this week. So describing core principles, looking at the role that records creators play in the construction of social memory, looking at how different aspects of archival practice connect and relate to each other, and describing how different aspects of archiving have influenced the archival profession. All right, so we'll start by looking at a couple definitions describing community archives and what they are. So Flynn and co-authors describe community archives as collections in which community members exercise some level of control over records. That level of control varies, but the core idea is active participation by a community in documenting and making accessible its own history on its own terms. Participation is a major theme here and something we've discussed over the past several weeks. And it's also, as we'll note later, one of the key features that distinguishes community archives from more traditional archival institutions. As the Vala notes, community archives can be organized around many different identities: ethnic, racial, religious, gender, sexual identity, economic class, and geographic location. You could throw in interest as well. And the casual chapter reminds us that many of these identities, such as race and gender, are socially constructed. Even so, people still identify strongly with them and use them as organizing principles for community archives, often for purposes of political action, representation, and empowerment. Community archives are often intersectional. A single archive might center on Black LGBTQ communities or Jewish communities in Milwaukee, for example. Some archives are very specific, while others are quite broad. The South Asian American Digital Archive is a good example of a broader community archive spanning many national and cultural backgrounds. One important point Caswell raises is that community archives can exclude as well as include. We often think of them as empowering and equitable spaces, but exclusion can still occur. For example, someone who identifies as transgender may feel alienated if a so-called LGBTQ plus archive lacks meaningful trans representation. There can be a disconnect between who an archive claims to represent and who is actually represented, and we'll talk more about that later. Caswell also notes that some community archives serve dominant communities, such as certain historical societies that reinforce existing power structures. She distinguishes these from community archives created specifically to resist marginalization and oppression. It's interesting to note some connections between community archives and personal archives. Personal archives can contain content and context that illustrate the complexity, development, and presence of a community over time. And so there is a strong connection there. For example, personal records such as home movies, letters, and journals can capture experiences that formal records often miss. Caswell's discussion of immigration and assimilation illustrates how personal archives document lived experience in meaningful ways. And if archivists fail to value personal archives, entire dimensions of community history can be lost. Organizational records, especially those created by outsiders, may present harmful or inaccurate portrayals of a community. If these are the only records preserved, they shape future understanding of a community in deeply problematic ways. Personal archives, when preserved, help legitimize community experiences and resist distorted official narratives. So we'll echo some of these points for what communities archives are when we talk about why community archives exist. Caswell and Magoni frame community archives as a response to historical disempowerment and to what they call symbolic annihilation, when communities are ignored, misrepresented, or erased from the historical record. Their article does a good job of conveying the thoughts and experiences of community members that have experienced symbolic annihilation. One of the ways that symbolic annihilation can occur is through the appraisal decisions that archivists make. If archives choose not to collect records related to a community, that community may disappear from the historical record. Arrangement and description can also misrepresent communities through harmful or inaccurate language. Online access can distort perceptions by highlighting only fragments of a community's experience that reinforce stereotypes. Community archives arise to counter this power imbalance, to reclaim authority over representation. Caswell goes even further, arguing that Western archives have historically supported systems such as white supremacy, colonialism, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy. Whether one agrees fully with her argument or not, and I don't necessarily agree, it's clear that archives have often contributed, intentionally or not, to marginalization, and community archives are created and exist to work against this marginalization. Next, we'll look at some essential aspects of community archives. Caswell emphasizes an important aspect of community archives is that the community represented in the records has a strong say in how they're kept. This differs from situations in which community records may be held by mainstream archives, but community members are not involved in their care. Caswell and Magoni argue that community archives should support a community member's ability to prove that they exist, their community exists, and both belong in society. Caswell and Magoni also note that community archives should influence the development of skills in volunteers, the preservation of narratives not found in mainstream institutions, and promote community pride, citizenship, empowerment, and social inclusion. As we've touched on already, community participation is a vital aspect of community archives and something we'll revisit later on in this lecture. Another characteristic of community archiving is that it challenges traditional custody models through practices such as post-custodialism, where records are digitized and returned to their creators, or when creators have control over record-keeping decisions surrounding their records. Zavala discusses the benefits of this approach and how it supports community ownership. Participation also affects governance. If only a narrow segment of a community makes decisions, representation can still become distorted. True community archives require broad and inclusive participation. Community archives also expand what counts as a record. Ephemeral materials and alternative formats, often ignored by traditional archives, are valued. This challenges long-standing archival hierarchies about authenticity, reliability, format, and provenance. Caswell emphasizes that community archives reject the myth of neutrality and instead acknowledge the emotional dimensions of records. She describes community archives as valuing people over stuff. By challenging traditional evaluation practices, community archives work against systems that have long privileged certain identities over others. As we'll discuss in a minute, how thoroughly community archives challenge traditional archival practices depend on how they respond to significant challenges that they face. Let's make some connections between community archives and social justice, which we talked about last week. If community archives respond to oppression and symbolic annihilation, the connections to social justice are clear. Community archives may strive towards social justice goals such as full human recognition, disruption of structures of non-recognition, fair redistribution of power, full and equal participation, and acknowledgement and remediation of historical inequalities. Again, participation is central to a community archive's social justice efforts. Community members shape representation rather than being portrayed by distant institutions. This is closely related to the idea of a fair and just distribution of power. When we talk about the disruption of structures of non-recognition, Caswell would include mainstream archives in this category of institutions meant to be challenged by community archives in some of the ways we discussed in the previous slide. Community archives may be able to contribute to social justice to a greater degree than other archives because of the reasons for their creation, which we discussed earlier in this lecture. However, there are additional aspects of community archives that allow them to embrace a role of promoting social justice more thoroughly. A community archive's knowledge of a community may give them more influence over potential donors, which could benefit the identification and preservation of records that could support social justice causes. Community archivists may be in a better position to identify important donors within the community and work to collect or support the preservation of their records. A community archive may enjoy a high level of trust from community members, which can lead to community members feeling more comfortable providing the archive with personal and sensitive records. As we've discussed, these are often the records most capable of supporting social justice causes due to their ability to serve as evidence of wrongdoing and marginalization. If a community archive acts in the community's best interests and develops a track record of supporting community causes, community members may value the archive. Of course, both of these conditions depend on the community archive being seen as a responsive, reflective, and responsible steward of a community's records. Issues surrounding participation in community archives can detract from this perception by community members. Community archives may be more capable of providing effective access to community members due to their knowledge of the ways community members prefer to access records. They may also be more capable of providing access that is culturally sensitive and responsible due to their familiarity with the community's values and traditions. However, as we've discussed in this class, truly effective access requires substantial infrastructure to appraise, process, and preserve archival records. As we'll discuss later, community archives may not have these resources. Familiarity with a community may positively shape a community archive's outreach efforts and its ability to invite participation. Knowing who community members are and where they're most likely to gather can give community archives an advantage when choosing how and when to approach community members. However, given the sensitivity of participation issues inherent to community archives, targeted and low-scale outreach may be more beneficial to a community archive than broader outreach efforts. It's important to consider some of the challenges that community archives may face. A big challenge facing community archives is the determination of who gets to contribute to record-keeping decisions and what that decision-making looks like. For a community archive to truly be from the community, this participation must be deep and broad. But community politics, another challenge for community archives, can impact choices about who is part of the community and thus should have a seat at the table when record-keeping decisions are made. This can be particularly true when a community archive is meant to represent a community and community members who feel marginalized and excluded from other forms of meaningful and accurate representation. Participation can grow even more complicated for community archives that represent particularly broad communities, such as the queer community as a whole or an entire religion. This broad tent approach can result in only a certain part of the community participating, while the archive claims to represent those not present in its decision-making or records. Facilitating this participation and then leveraging it into actual record-keeping practices requires a complex and sustainable infrastructure, including access to expertise, technology, time, and financial investment, particularly if a community archive occupies a physical space instead of a virtual one. A vital type of infrastructure is long-term buy-in and support from the community, which can be lessened if community members feel that the community archive is making decisions that don't reflect the needs and preferences of the community. Sustainability issues for community archives are exacerbated by the fact that they typically exist outside of an established academic or corporate organization that provides them with at least some funding. In addition, community groups may lack expertise in applying for grant funding or may be reluctant to work with partners viewed as extensions of state and corporate actors that have contributed to social injustice towards the community in the past. One additional complicating factor that the Caswell and Magoni article notes is that the impacts of community archives, such as fostering a sense of belonging among community members and increasing community pride, can be difficult to quantify in order to meet the requirements of neoliberal funding sources. Sustainability issues can be influenced by the size of the community the archive seeks to represent. While larger communities may present issues related to participation and non-participation, they do provide a larger base of potential support for a community archive. Community archives that seek to represent more intersectional communities, such as Jewish gay males in Milwaukee's East Side, may struggle to be relevant to a large number of people and thus be more reliant on a handful of supporters. Local and national politics can present a challenge to community archives. There may be times, depending on the political situation in a given area, in which a community archive may feel more or less comfortable promoting itself and engaging in activist behavior. It's understandable that the communities that have faced marginalization and exclusion in the past may prefer to keep things close to the vest during challenging times locally or nationally. It's important to note that some communities may view challenging conditions as exactly the time that advocacy and outreach are most important. This will vary from community to community, and ideally, these decisions are made with significant community participation and input. These challenges can create situations in which community archives fall short of addressing social justice goals, no matter how lofty their mission or ideals. For example, if certain parts of a community are not able or not welcome to participate in decision-making surrounding the archive and its holdings, full recognition may not be achieved, nor full and equal participation. In this instance, a fair and just distribution of power may not take place either. This could be intentional or unintentional. It may be that a community archive simply doesn't have the resources to foster the level of participation required to meaningfully address social justice issues. This failure could also be an intentional act to deign certain parts of a community as those that matter and exclude those that don't. All of this is to say that although community archives are born out of an effort to empower community members and fight against marginalization and misrepresentation, this outcome is far from assured and instead depends on a variety of factors that may or may not be ones the community can control. We'll close things up by talking about types of creation in archives and how they connect to community archives. In a community archive setting, obviously the community is going to have a big role in determining which records are available for researchers. However, this will depend on how deep and broad community participation is. If it is not meaningful, then it may be the case that the community archivist may have an outsized role in making this determination, which does not exactly reflect the purpose of community archives. Of course, every archive is shaped by the creators and custodians that provide us records. It's possible that donors and custodians of community records will feel less pressure to censor themselves or records in their care if they have more of a sense that community archivists will be aware of and respect any sensitive issues found in donated records, which of course we can connect to ideas of the archiving eye and the archived eye that we discussed earlier on in this course. Okay, so that's our lecture for community archives, short but sweet, but nonetheless something that connects to a lot of the topics we've talked about in this class. If you want to learn more about community archives, we do have a community archives course through UWM. It's a part of the archives MLIS concentration. But if you're just a regular MLIS student, or I'm sorry, not an archives MLIS student, you can take it as well. So if this piqued your interest, please feel free to do that. Thank you for your efforts this semester. I hope you learned a lot about archiving. I hope you haven't become too cynical or jaded about archives. They really can be wonderful and influential and healthy organizations that do benefit society. But as we've talked about throughout this course and this week, there are a lot of things that can be less than ideal about archives, and so it's important to consider how you as future professionals, future archivists, if you go down that path, can address some of those issues. So I hope that this course has given you a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much for your attention and effort throughout the semester. As always, let me know if you have any questions about anything, and take care of yourselves.